Hey everyone, it's Thursday. Welcome back to Echoes from the Source, our deep
Absolutely.
dive into wisdom teachings.
All right.
Um, this is our 5th episode, and today we're turning to Gurudev's book, An Intimate Note to a Sincere Seeker.
Okay.
This is one chapter that really struck me.
Okay.
It uses the metaphor of the master as a door to talk about facing life's challenges and finding inner peace.
I like it.
Yeah, I've been grappling with a situation lately that's got me feeling like I'm stuck out in the storm, so I'm really curious to see what insights we can uncover here.
Well, that's a powerful image. The master as a door, it immediately makes me think of seeking shelter and finding solace, but I'm sensing there's a lot more to unpack here. What specifically grabbed your attention in this chapter?
Well, the idea that we can shift our perspective to see the world through the master's eyes, even when things get tough. Like, how would the master handle things if they were being criticized or blamed?
Ooh.
It feels like a whole different way of approaching those situations that usually leave me feeling rattled.
That's a great question to start with. It gets to the heart of what this metaphor is really about, not just physical proximity to a teacher, but internalizing their wisdom so deeply that you begin to see the world through their lens.
Right.
Gurudev doesn't limit the idea of a master to a specific person either.
Okay.
It could be a spiritual figure, a mentor, even an internalized set of principles. It's about embodying a certain way of being.
So it's less about having someone physically there to guide you and more about cultivating that inner compass, that steady presence, even when things feel chaotic.
Exactly. The door represents that shift in perception, that transition from feeling battered by the storm to finding a sense of inner stability. And to answer your question about criticism, imagine this. The master wouldn't get caught up in the drama of blame.
Right.
They wouldn't react defensively. Instead, they'd respond with grace and compassion
Yeah.
because they're not clinging to praise or fearing blame.
Okay.
Their sense of self-worth isn't dependent on those external fluctuations.
Okay. That makes sense, but honestly, it sounds really difficult. I know I get pretty hooked when someone throws criticism my way, and staying calm and composed feels almost impossible.
Yeah.
It's like my default reaction is to defend myself or get upset.
Yeah.
Are there any real-world examples in the chapter that show how this actually plays out?
There are actually two stories that illustrate this beautifully.
Right.
One is about a woman named Anna,
Okay.
who was juggling work deadlines and family pressures, feeling completely overwhelmed. She's a great example of someone standing at that metaphorical door,
Right.
wanting that inner peace, but still very much caught in the storm of her own anxieties.
That sounds incredibly relatable. So what was the turning point for her? What helped her step through that door?
It was a question, actually. She remembered Gurudev's teachings and thought, what would the master do in this situation?
Oh.
She realized that instead of reacting with anger or frustration, which was her usual pattern, she could choose to respond with calmness.
So simply asking that question shifted her perspective enough to change her behavior. Yeah. I'm curious what happened next. Did it actually make a difference in her situation?
It did.
Wow.
By responding with calmness instead of reacting with her usual intensity, she was able to de-escalate a tense situation at work.
Wow.
The storm, so to speak, calmed down because she changed her internal weather.
Right.
It highlights how powerful even subtle shifts in perspective can be.
That's a great example of how applying the master's teachings, even in a small way, can create a ripple effect. But what about when the criticism is more public, more damaging?
Yeah.
Is it even possible to stay grounded in that kind of situation?
That's where Raj's story comes in.
Okay.
He was facing public criticism at work, which naturally triggered feelings of hurt and humiliation.
Right.
He wanted to lash out, defend himself, maybe even retaliate, but
Yeah.
then he remembered Gurudev's teaching the master doesn't react to blame. They meet it with silence and strength.
Wow, that sounds incredibly difficult, especially when you're feeling publicly attacked.
Yeah.
So what did he actually do?
Instead of getting swept up in the drama, he chose to listen quietly, really take in the feedback, and then address it later from a calm and centered place. He embodied that sense of presence that we were talking about earlier, that inner stillness that isn't easily shaken.
And what was the outcome? Did people just think he was ignoring them, or did his approach actually shift the situation?
It shifted everything.
Wow.
His colleagues were taken aback by his composure instead of escalating the conflict. His calm response actually created a space for genuine dialogue.
Mm.
It's a powerful example of how embodying the master's presence can transform not just our inner state, but
Mhm.
also the energy of the situation itself.
These are such fascinating examples. They really show the power of internalizing the master's teachings and applying them in those moments when we're tempted to react impulsively. But how do we actually bridge that gap between hearing these inspiring stories and putting them into practice in our own lives?
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to admire Anna and Raj's composure, but how do we cultivate that kind of inner strength ourselves?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And is what we'll explore next. Gurudev doesn't just leave us with these stories. He offers specific practices and techniques for cultivating that master's presence within ourselves.
This is where it gets really interesting. I'm ready to dive into those practical steps and see how we can integrate this wisdom into our daily lives.
Let's do it. I think you'll find that these teachings offer some surprisingly tangible tools for navigating even the most challenging situations.
Can't wait to hear more.
All right, so where do we even begin to cultivate this master's presence within ourselves?
Right.
It can feel like a daunting task, especially when our habitual reactions are so strong.
I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
I know for me, it's that knee-jerk reaction to get defensive when I feel criticized. Even if it's constructive feedback, it's like this automatic program takes over.
You've hit on something really important. It's about recognizing those ingrained patterns, those default reactions that often run on autopilot. Gurudev emphasizes the importance of detaching from praise and blame, and this is where it becomes really practical. Think back to the metaphor of the storm. When you're safe inside, sheltered from the wind and rain, you're not affected by the external chaos. It's the same with our inner state. When we're overly attached to praise, our sense of self-worth becomes dependent on external validation. And when we're overly sensitive to blame, we're essentially giving others the power to dictate our emotional state.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like we're constantly being tossed around by the winds of external opinions instead of finding that inner stability. But how do we actually practice this detachment? It's easier said than done, right?
It is, but with practice it becomes more natural. Gurudev suggests starting with awareness, simply noticing how you react when someone compliments you or criticizes you. Do you feel a surge of happiness or a pang of hurt? Just observe those feelings without judgment.
So it's about becoming more mindful of those reactions, creating a little space between the stimulus and our habitual response.
Precisely. And as we practice this, we start to disentangle our true selves from those fleeting emotions. We create that inner sanctuary where praise or blame can't shake us. It's like building an internal foundation that's strong enough to withstand the storms of external opinions.
That's such a powerful image. I can see how cultivating that inner stability would make us less reactive, less likely to get swept away by the drama of everyday interactions. But let's be honest, there are times when the criticism feels justified, when we've genuinely messed up. How do we reconcile this idea of detachment with taking responsibility for our actions?
That's a great point. And it's not about denying responsibility or becoming emotionally numb. Detachment doesn't mean indifference. It's about finding that sweet spot where we can acknowledge our mistakes without letting them completely derail our sense of self.
So it's about recognizing that we're all works in progress, capable of both great things and, well, not so great things.
Exactly. We can hold ourselves accountable without getting caught in a cycle of self-judgment and shame. Gurudev tells a story about a wise old sage who was publicly accused of wrongdoing. The villagers were furious, hurling insults and blaming him for all sorts of misfortunes.
Knowing this framework, I'm guessing he didn't exactly engage in a heated argument. What was his response?
He simply listened patiently without saying a word. His composure completely disarmed the villagers. They expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even fear. But he met their rage with quiet strength, and when they were finally spent, he simply said, "Thank you for sharing your feelings. I will take them into consideration."
That's incredible. He acknowledged their feelings without getting caught up in the drama or trying to defend himself. It's a beautiful example of how true strength lies, not in reacting, but in responding from a place of wisdom and composure.
It is, and it highlights another key practice that Gurudev emphasizes, cultivating inner presence through practices like meditation.
Okay, this is something I've struggled with. Meditation always seemed a bit too woo-woo for me, too esoteric. But I'm open to hearing how it connects to this idea of the master's presence.
It's not about chanting mantras on a mountaintop, if that's what you're picturing. It can be as simple as taking a few minutes each day to sit quietly, to observe your breath, to simply be present with yourself without judgment. Think of it as training your attention, strengthening that muscle of awareness.
So it's like creating a mental gym for our minds, strengthening our ability to focus and be present, even when surrounded by chaos.
Exactly. And the more we practice, the easier it becomes to access that stillness, that inner sanctuary, even in the midst of challenging situations. We're essentially cultivating that same sense of composure that the sage embodied when facing the angry villagers.
That makes a lot of sense, but let's be realistic. Life is full of distractions, demands, and those unexpected moments that throw us off balance. How do we actually integrate these practices into our busy, often chaotic lives?
It's about making small, consistent efforts rather than aiming for perfection. Even a few minutes of meditation each day can make a difference. And there's another simple but powerful practice that Gurudev highlights: pausing before reacting.
This is something I've heard before, but honestly, I struggle to actually remember it in the heat of the moment. It's like my emotions take over before I even realize what's happening.
It's a practice just like meditation. It takes time and effort to rewire those habitual reactions. Think of it this way: between every stimulus and response, there's a gap, a space where we have the power to choose. Most of the time, we react unconsciously out of habit or emotion, but when we pause even for a moment, we create that space for conscious choice.
So it's about interrupting that autopilot mode, that knee-jerk reaction, and creating a space for more skillful responding.
Precisely, and that's where the master's teachings can guide us. It's not about being perfect, it's about learning and growing from each experience. Gurudev suggests a simple but powerful question to ask ourselves in that moment of pause: how would the master respond?
I love that it's like inviting that wise, compassionate presence into our hearts and minds, allowing it to guide our actions. But how do we even know what the master would do? I mean, it's not like we can pick up the phone and ask.
It's about tuning into the qualities that we associate with the master's presence: wisdom, compassion, understanding, equanimity. Imagine them facing the same situation. How would they approach it? What qualities would they embody?
So it's about internalizing those qualities, making them our own internal compass.
Exactly. And the more we practice, the more natural it becomes. It's like developing a new muscle, a muscle of wisdom and compassion. The more we use it, the stronger it gets.
This is all starting to click into place, but there's still one piece that feels a bit fuzzy for me. We've talked about detachment meditation, pausing before reacting, and asking, how would the masters respond? But how does compassion fit into this framework? I mean, it's a beautiful concept. But how do we actually cultivate more compassion in our daily lives?
That's a great question, and it's the perfect segue into our next topic. Compassion is the heart of the master's presence, and it's something we'll explore in depth after a quick break.
I'm so intrigued to hear more about this. Stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We've been on quite a journey exploring this metaphor of the master as a door, and I'm really excited to delve into this aspect of compassion.
Yeah, it's the heart of the matter, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've talked about cultivating inner stability, pausing before reacting, all incredibly valuable tools.
Right.
But without compassion, they lack a certain depth, a genuine connection to the human experience.
I can see that it's like we could become incredibly composed and self-controlled, but still lack that warmth, that genuine care for ourselves and others.
Exactly. Gurudev defines compassion not just as feeling sympathy,
Okay.
but as a deep understanding of suffering coupled with a genuine desire to alleviate it. It's about taking action even in small ways to make a positive difference.
So it's not just a passive feeling, but an active force, something that motivates us to move beyond simply feeling sorry for someone to actually doing something to help.
Precisely. And it begins with a fundamental shift in perspective.
Hmm.
Recognizing that everyone, including ourselves, is on their own unique journey, facing their own unique set of challenges and struggles.
It's like remembering that we all have our own storms to weather, our own internal battles to fight.
That's a great way to put it. And when we hold that awareness, it becomes easier to extend compassion even to those who've hurt or wronged us. We begin to see their actions not as personal attacks, but as expressions of their own pain or confusion.
That's a tough one for me.
Yeah.
I'll admit, when someone's actions have directly impacted me, it's hard to see past the hurt and anger. Do you have any advice for cultivating compassion in those really difficult situations?
Gurudev offers a practice that I found incredibly helpful in those moments.
Okay.
He suggests picturing the person you're struggling with as a small child.
That's an interesting approach. I can see how it would soften those harsh judgments we tend to make.
It does. When we see someone as a child, it taps into a deeper well of empathy. We remember their inherent vulnerability, their capacity for innocence. It allows us to see their actions through a more compassionate lens.
It's like shifting from that place of judgment to a place of understanding, remembering that everyone is doing the best they can with the tools and resources they have at that moment.
Exactly. And it doesn't mean condoning harmful behavior or allowing ourselves to be mistreated, boundaries are still important.
Right.
But compassion allows us to hold those boundaries with firmness and clarity while still extending a sense of kindness and understanding.
It's like that saying, be kind for everyone you meet, is fighting a hard battle. It reminds us to approach each other with a bit more grace and a lot less judgment.
That's a beautiful sentiment, and it speaks to the transformative power of compassion. It's not just about being nice, it's about recognizing our shared humanity and extending kindness even when it's difficult.
I can see how that aligns with the idea of the master's presence. It's not about being perfect or always having the right answers. It's about responding to life's challenges with wisdom, courage, and a deep sense of care for ourselves and others.
Absolutely. Gurudev often says that compassion is not weakness, it's
Um,
strength.
Right.
Because true compassion requires us to step outside of our own limited perspective and connect with the experiences of others.
It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, that our well-being is interconnected.
Beautifully said so. As we wrap up our deep dive into this chapter,
Yeah,
to ponder.
I think that's a great idea. This has been such a rich and thought-provoking conversation, and I'm already feeling inspired to put these teachings into practice.
Remember, the master is not just a person, but a state of being. It's a quality that resides within each of us, waiting to be cultivated and expressed.
So as you go about your day, ask yourself, how can I embody the Master's presence in my own life? How can I bring more wisdom, compassion, and inner peace into my interactions with the world?
It's an invitation to step into our highest potential, to live a life that reflects the qualities we most admire in the master. Basically, it's all about how to find this inner peace when everything around you is just nuts. I mean, all the source material we've been looking at, they all paint this really vivid image of this crazy storm going on outside this door, but then inside, total warmth, security, peace, the whole 9 yards.
So it's kind of like finding shelter from a storm, but like the shelter is inside of you this whole time.
You got it. And get this, going through this door doesn't mean all that outside stuff goes away. All those conflicts at work, the relationship stuff, anxieties, they're all still there. It's more about changing how you look at it and how you react to it all.
That makes me think about all those times when I'm in like an argument, and the first thing I want to do is get all defensive or I start stressing out. So is this Master's door like learning to respond differently?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it really gets at what Gurudev calls seeing the world through the master's eyes. And it's important to know all the sources agree it doesn't have to be about like an actual person or guru or whatever. It's more about embodying certain qualities.
Okay, so we're not talking about finding some guru on a mountaintop. It's more about like cultivating a way of being. So what are those qualities? What makes up this master's perspective anyway?
Well, if you look at what the sources say, the big ones are wisdom, compassion, and then there's this thing called equanimity. It's this feeling of being calm and centered. Like imagine a mountain in the middle of a storm, not really fazed by all the crazy stuff going on around it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Instead of getting tossed around by every little problem that pops up, we find this solid center inside ourselves.
Exactly. And from there, you can deal with life's curveballs with, way more clarity and wisdom. It's not about ignoring the storm altogether, but more like navigating it with, with more skill and stuff.
You know what? The source material actually mentions this story about a woman named Anna who used this perspective to deal with someone criticizing her at work. But she didn't get all defensive about it. Instead, she just stopped for a second and asked herself, how would the master handle this? And just asking that question, it seems like it helped her find that inner stability.
It's a great example of how changing how you feel inside can lead to a totally different outcome. Like Anna didn't even try to change the situation or the person who was criticizing her. She just changed how she reacted on the inside. And you know what? It actually calmed things down, and the person even apologized to her.
So the master's perspective, it's not about just accepting whatever happens. It's about responding with wisdom and compassion. Like Anna didn't just ignore the criticism, she handled it calmly, and that's what made things better.
You got it. And that's a really important takeaway here. It's about embodying the master's qualities, the wisdom to see what's really going on, the compassion to see where the other person's coming from, and that equanimity thing, to stay centered even when things are tough.
This reminds me of something Gurudev writes in his book, An Intimate Note to a Sincere Seeker. Actually, there's a whole chapter about the master's door concept.
Oh, yeah. That's a fantastic book. Gurudev really goes deep on how to actually use this metaphor in that chapter. He even talks about how the door's always open, like it's always there. It's just up to us to, actually decide to walk through it, especially when we're feeling overwhelmed and stuff.
Right. That's so important. It's like knowing there's this warm, cozy cabin in the middle of a blizzard, but you just completely forget to go inside.
That's a perfect analogy. We can get so caught up in all the emotions and everything that we forget about the peace that's already inside of us. And, that's where all these practical tips from the source material come in. Like, they talk about using little mental cues, like things to help us remember about the master's door.
Yeah, like visualizing a door when you're feeling stressed, or even just asking yourself, what would the masters do? It's so simple, but it seems like it would actually work, to shift your perspective.
Yeah, totally. Because instead of just reacting right away out of fear or anger or whatever, you take a second. You create a little space for yourself to be more mindful about how you respond. And that space, that pause, that's when you walk through the master's door.
So it's about interrupting that automatic reaction and choosing a different path. But what about those times when you just totally forget about the door? Like the sources mention that you can get so overwhelmed that you completely lose sight of it.
Oh, for sure. You're right. It's not always easy. Some of the sources talk about using little reminders you can see, like maybe a picture of a door on your desk or a note you put on your mirror. And it's important to remember that the master's door is, it's a metaphor. We're not literally talking about finding a door somewhere. It's all about accessing that inner peace, that wisdom that we all have inside of us.
That reminds me of this story about Mark from the source material. He was dealing with a lot of anxiety about getting criticism at work. Like, he would get so nervous whenever his boss gave him feedback, he would just overthink everything and lose sleep over it. But then he started using this master's door concept.
Oh, yeah, Mark's story. That's a great example of how changing your perspective can really make a difference in your life. So instead of freaking out about the criticism, he would ask himself, what would the master do before he responded?
And it sounds like asking himself that question helped him respond in a way that was more calm, clear, and even grateful for the feedback. His anxiety got better, and his relationship with his boss actually improved.
Exactly. It shows how embodying the master's qualities, it doesn't just change how you feel inside, but it can also change your relationships with other people. By being more understanding and graceful, you actually make things more harmonious around you.
It's like the calmness and clarity that you cultivate inside yourself, it starts to affect how you interact with everyone else. So this master's perspective, it's not just about finding peace for yourself, it's about creating a more peaceful world.
Absolutely. And it's not like you flip a switch and you're there. It's a journey, not a destination. We're not going to be perfect all the time, but every time we choose to walk through that door, we're practicing. We're getting stronger in those areas of wisdom, compassion, and equanimity.
Like building a muscle, right? You
Yeah.
stumble, you get back up, and eventually it becomes more natural to respond to problems from that master's perspective.
You got it. And the more we do it, the easier it becomes to find that inner peace and wisdom, even when things are crazy around us. That door's always open, just waiting for us.
This deep dive has been so insightful. I can already see how I can start using this master's door concept in my own life.
I'm so glad to hear that. It's a really powerful metaphor, and it can be really practical. And speaking of practical stuff, the sources also talk about how important it is to ask ourselves, like, really good questions, like, whenever something difficult comes up, we should stop and ask, what's on the other side of the master's door?
Whoa, that's a really interesting question. It's like you're inviting yourself to step into this place of like wisdom and clarity and all that. But what happens when you actually walk through the door? What's there?
Well, all the sources kind of describe it as this place where there's inner peace and everything's clear and you feel connected to something bigger than yourself. It's like this feeling of being grounded and centered, even when everything around you is chaotic.
So it's kind of like that equanimity thing we were talking about
Yeah.
before, right? Like being a mountain in the middle of a storm.
Exactly. And from that place, that centered place, we can tap into the wisdom and compassion that the master embodies. A lot of the sources talk about asking yourself, how would the master approach this? Or what would the master do?
Those are some pretty powerful questions. It's like you're inviting the master's perspective into how you make decisions.
You got it. And just by asking yourself those questions, you start to embody those qualities. The wisdom to see things clearly, the compassion to understand where everyone's coming from, and that equanimity to stay calm and centered no matter what.
This whole deep dive has really given me a lot to think about, especially like all the practical tips, like picturing the door and asking yourself those empowering questions.
I'm so glad to hear that. Remember that master's door is always open. It's up to us to decide to walk through it, especially when those tough times come along, which they always do, right? It encourages us to take what we've learned and really connect it to our own lives, to find that wisdom inside ourselves. Well, the writings lay out a few steps. First, they say to make a habit of pausing and reflecting. When something difficult pops up, before you react in your usual way, take a breath and ask yourself, how would the master respond?
Hmm. So it's like having this wise mentor in your head, kind of guiding you toward a better way to handle things.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings us to the second step, actively shifting our perspective. Remember, this being inside the door with the master doesn't mean life suddenly becomes a breeze. Challenges are still going to come up.
Yeah.
But we can face them, with more of that inner security.
Right. So the storm might still be there, but we're not out there getting drenched, right?
Exactly. We've found that safe space inside. And this brings up this really interesting idea from the source material about feeling the presence of the master.
Okay. What do they mean by presence?
Well, it's not like having another, relationship in your life with all the expectations and drama that usually comes with that.
Oh, phew.
Yeah, it's more about tapping into this vast, stable presence that's always there, offering guidance, that kind of strength.
This whole presence idea, I have to say, it's really intriguing. And, it reminds me of something I read in Gurudev's book, An Intimate Note to a Sincere Seeker. He describes the master as this guiding light, not someone who, jumps in and solves all our problems for us, but who helps us find the solutions that are already within us.
Oh, absolutely. That's a perfect connection. And it really drives home the point that the master's presence is about empowering us, helping us find our own inner wisdom.
Which brings us back to that image of the door, right? Stepping through it isn't about finding a place to escape, but finding a new state of mind, a way of being that allows us to handle anything that comes up with the Master's wisdom and grace. But how do we actually cultivate that connection with the Master's presence? How do we do that?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Gurudev, in An Intimate Note to a Sincere Seeker, really goes deep into this. And actually, there's a whole chapter that outlines all these practical techniques for cultivating that connection with the master's presence.
Oh, I'm so curious. This is the stuff that really gets me excited. Moving beyond, the metaphors and getting into the practical stuff. How do we actually do it?
Well, one of the most powerful techniques he talks about is this practice of what he calls inner disentanglement.
Inner disentanglement. Wow, okay, that sounds pretty intense.
It might sound kind of complex, but the idea itself is actually pretty straightforward. Gurudev says that a lot of times we get so caught up in our own thoughts and emotions, even our desires, that we lose touch with our true selves, that inner peace where the master's presence resides.
Oh, I get it. It's like we're so bombarded with external noise that we can't hear that inner voice of wisdom.
Exactly. So inner disentanglement is about creating some space between ourselves and those thoughts and emotions. It's not about pretending they don't exist or trying to suppress them.
So we're not aiming to become like these emotionless robots.
No, not at all. It's more about just observing those thoughts and emotions, with a sense of detachment, recognizing that they're not who we really are.
I like that. So it's like watching clouds passing by. You see them, but you don't have to cling to them or let them, define you.
That's a great analogy. And Gurudev gives this really simple but profound technique to practice this inner disentanglement. He calls it witness consciousness.
Witness consciousness. Okay, you got to tell me more.
It's about taking a step back from our thoughts and emotions and just kind of observing them without judging them. Imagine yourself as a witness watching your mind at work, but not getting caught up in all the drama.
So it's like we're creating that space between ourselves and our thoughts, that disentanglement you were talking about.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And as we practice this witness consciousness, something really cool starts to happen.
What's that?
We start to tap into this deeper level of awareness, a stillness inside that's always there, even in the middle of all the chaos of our minds.
Oh, I love that. It's like we're finally finding that shelter from the storm, that inner sanctuary.
Exactly. And from this place of stillness and clarity, we can connect with the master's presence in a really deep way.
This is making so much sense to me. It's like we have to clear away all that mental clutter to make room for that deeper connection.
That's a great way to put it. And Gurudev emphasizes that this witness consciousness thing isn't just something you do like every once in a while. It's a way of life, a continuous awareness that we try to cultivate all day long.
So it's less like a one-time meditation session and more like an ongoing shift in how we see things.
Exactly. And as we make this awareness part of our lives, we start to see the world through the master's eyes, responding to challenges with wisdom, compassion, and that unshakable inner peace we all want.
I gotta say, this whole witness consciousness idea is really speaking to me. But I imagine it takes practice, right? Like anything else.
Oh, absolutely. It's a skill you develop over time, like learning an instrument or anything. But the more you practice, the easier it gets.
And it seems like the benefits are huge, right? It's like we're getting access to this endless source of peace and wisdom.
And that's the amazing thing about this journey. The more we cultivate that connection with the master's presence, the more we see how much potential each of us has. It's limitless.
This has been so insightful. We've really gone beyond the surface level and got to the core of this concept. But I am curious, are there any other techniques that Gurudev shares in his book that can help us on this journey?
Definitely. In an intimate note to a sincere seeker, Gurudev offers like a whole toolkit of practices, each designed to help us cultivate that connection with the master's presence. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to look at another really cool technique that he calls.
All right, we're back and ready to hear about another one of Gurudev's techniques, from an intimate note to a sincere seeker. What else can we add to this toolkit for getting closer to the master's presence?
Okay, well, this next one is called heart-based living, and it might just totally change how you approach life.
Heart-based living. Okay, I'm picturing like rainbows and butterflies. But really, what does that even mean?
Well, Gurudev says we often live from this place of ego, right? Driven by our fears and desires and the need for everyone to like us, And that actually creates this sense of separation from ourselves and from others.
Ah, I see. So it's like we're building walls instead of bridges.
Exactly. And those walls, they block us from really connecting with people and finding true fulfillment. Heart-based living, on the other hand, it's about shifting our focus from the ego to the heart.
It's less about what I want and more about connecting with that deeper sense of compassion and, connection with everyone.
Exactly. Gurudev describes the heart as the place where love and wisdom and intuition come from. That's where we connect with our true selves and with this feeling of being connected to everything.
That reminds me of what you were saying before about how the master's perspective includes this sense of connection with everything. It's like everything starts to click when we operate from the heart.
Yes, you got it. And when we live from the heart, we naturally start to embody the qualities of the master. That compassion, kindness, understanding, and that unshakable inner peace we talked about.
It sounds really amazing, but how do we actually live that way? I mean, how do we actually shift from, ego-based living to this heart-based living?
Well, Gurudev has some really practical advice. He says we need to focus on cultivating gratitude, practicing forgiveness, and acting with kindness and generosity.
Yeah, those are all things we usually associate with the heart. But how do those actions actually lead to a deeper change?
Think about it. When you're feeling grateful, you're focusing on the good stuff you already have, right? That opens your heart and creates a feeling of abundance.
Okay, so we're shifting our focus from what we're missing to what we already have.
Exactly. And forgiveness, even though it can be tough, it's actually an act of self-love. Holding on to resentment and anger, that just hurts us in the end. Forgiveness lets us let go of those negative emotions and, make space for healing and peace.
It's like we're stepping out of the storm and into the sunshine.
Right. And then there's kindness and generosity. When we act from a place of caring about others, we're naturally tapping into the energy of the heart.
Like we're building bridges instead of walls, right?
Exactly. Creating a more connected and compassionate world. And, as we practice these heart-based actions, something incredible happens. We start to feel different.
How so?
Well, we start to experience more joy and peace and fulfillment.
It's like the more we give from the heart, the bigger our hearts get.
That's such a beautiful way to put it. And as our hearts expand, they make more room for the master's presence to come through.
This is all coming together so well. We've explored techniques for quieting the mind, for shifting how we see things, and now for living from the heart. It's like we're building this set of practices that bring us closer to that inner sanctuary, that connection with the master's wisdom.
And the best part is that these practices aren't just about changing ourselves. They spread outward. They have a ripple effect on our relationships, our communities, and the world.
It's like we're all connected, and when we find inner peace, we're also helping to create a more peaceful and harmonious world.
You got it. That's the core of the Master's teachings, to find the peace within and share it with everyone.
Wow, this deep dive has been so insightful. I feel like I have this whole new understanding of what it really means to step through the master's door and find that unshakable inner peace.
I'm so glad. And remember, this is just the beginning. The journey doesn't end here. It's an ongoing process of learning and growing and discovering more wisdom and compassion. Keep practicing these techniques. Keep opening your heart, and you'll keep finding more peace and joy inside yourself. It's limitless. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey. We hope it's inspired you to explore your own inner depths and find that connection with the Master's presence in your own way.
Until next time, and spread that peace out into the world. Thank you for joining us on this journey of exploration. May you find peace, joy, and inspiration in your own unique path.